Okay, welcome everybody to my talk about full stack development. I'm Simon Martinelli and I'm a full stack developer. So looking at my timeline, I started with Java in the year 2000. Before I was a COBOL developer. Also there I was already a full stack developer on mainframe systems, but it was quite a different architecture. In the meanwhile, I'm also teaching at the university. I'm active in the Java community. I'm helping to organize Java user groups events in Bern, for example. And I received the Vaadin community event, and we will see Vaadin today, so I will show you what's about this framework. But before we start looking at some code, maybe some history. As you've seen, I'm working in software development for close to 30 years now. And as always, history repeats. So if we have look back in the 90s, we've seen this architecture mainly. So we had client servers, sometimes there was an application server, sometimes it was a direct access from the UI to the database. But usually developers were developing the whole application, so they were already full stack developers in these days. Later on, we saw that architecture style coming up. So we had separation between presentation, business, and persistence. And this, first of all, led to different technologies, maybe on the different layers that we could have. But in 1999, something else was invented. It was J2E. So J2E means Java Enterprise Edition, for those who don't know what it was. And they had an idea of how clients will be developed. So in contrast to the client-server architecture, they introduced something called an application server. So business logic, persistence, access was all done on this Java EE server. And the Java EE server itself was split into two parts. So we had the business logic part in the enterprise Java Beans container, and we had a web part to deliver static rendered websites. So the technology was Java Server Pages, and this delivered some data to the web browser, some HTML pages that were displayed. So it was all very static these days. On the other hand, we had this client-server stuff. It was called application client container, and it was usually AWT or a Java application. Later, it was an Eclipse RCP usually that talked to the enterprise beans with EJB remoting. And this stayed for a while. So based on this technology in the middle, the web container, there were other frameworks coming up. So we had Struts, we had Wicked, Java Surfaces, Thymeleaf, even Vaadin was using that. On the left side, you see all the client-server frameworks like Swing and also JavaFX that was later very important. But now, I would say around 15 years ago, it's changed. So the idea how to develop application changed. And what happened was this picture here. So what we still used was a server. So we used like Java application server these days. We had other technologies like Spring Boot, for example, that embedded the application server, but the application server is still there. But the change was mainly on the client side. So we didn't deliver static HTML pages. We tried to create the applications entirely in the browser. So we had client-server architecture again. And this means we have here, I just mentioned three of them, React, Angular, and Vue, but there are other technologies. Jonas Bondi will be talking about other technologies this afternoon. And this led to something new. It led to some type of developers. They were called front-end developers. And you may notice there are a lot of conferences today where people are just talking about the front-end stuff. And people also try to use front-end stuff in the backend, and there are other ideas. But very often when I go to my clients, I'm self-employed for now 14 years, they try to do this type of application development for any kind of applications. So it doesn't matter if it's really a fit, if you use that. If your developers are experts in technologies, they just do that because today we do software development that way. And in Switzerland, it's, or at least in Bern, Angular is the predominant technology that people are using now. So I usually, when I go into projects, I am faced with Angular and mostly Spring on the backend. But this technology or this architecture with the use of this technology has some impacts to the developers. Because before, you just have to know Java. So with the Java application server, you just needed to know Java and the technologies, some HTML maybe, but that's it. But if you look at this architecture, we have now not only 2 parts in the application, we have 3. So 2 are obvious. We have the client and we have the server, but the third one is the API. So if you develop your application, you have to develop 3 parts. First, you have to develop the business logic and the data access, for example. On the other hand, you have to develop the UI, and then you have to decide how they will communicate together. And there is, again, another technology, because before we had like HTTP remoting or Java RMI, where we stayed in the Java ecosystem, but now we have something like REST APIs or GraphQL in applications that another technology comes up and that you have to learn as well. The biggest problem, in my opinion, for most Java developers, but is the ecosystem on the client. So you have to learn a new build system, you have to learn new tools. You may see the same concepts, but there are also completely different concepts that you may not have on the server side today, and you have to learn that. And then you have to integrate that, you have to create a build, and that all takes time. And if you're a big company and you have a separation between front-end and back-end development, this may be fine. But if you're a small company, and my clients are usually small businesses, then this is a problem because you have to learn a lot of stuff. And in my talk, I call it Simon's Selection, I will show you some web frameworks that are made for Java developers. So some of them will be plain Java, and others of them will embrace the new style of web development, but will make it easier for you as a full-stack developer. And these 3 technologies are Thymeleaf, Vaadin, and Hilla. So if we start with Thymeleaf, this is a very old framework already. So Spring MVC, when it was invented, was looking for like a template engine to render static HTML pages, and so looks the architecture. So you have a controller, and the controller delivers a template that will be rendered and then sent to the browser as a static HTML page. Last year I was at the Spring I/O conference, and I met Wim de Blauw. He's an author of a Thymeleaf book, and he was showing how to add some dynamic stuff to static rendered Thymeleaf pages. And the framework is htmx. htmx is the idea that you can write dynamic code without writing JavaScript. So you have to just add a few tags, and then your page will become dynamic. We will see that in the demo later on. So that's a traditional way how to write HTML pages. In the middle we have Vaadin. Who already heard of Vaadin? A lot of you. Because Vaadin is a very old framework. It's even older than Thymeleaf. Vaadin is from 2001, so it's 22 years old. I think it's maybe older as some of the guys here in front in the audience. And traditionally it was using Google Web Toolkit, and Google Web Toolkit is no longer supported by Google, so they rebuilt Vaadin. So it's a complete different architecture, means you have the whole UI logic in Java on the server side, and you have Vaadin Flow is the name of the framework in the browser, and the browser communicates with the backend and sends more or less like a JSON response to the client, and Vaadin Flow then renders or creates the DOM or manipulates the DOM based on this JavaScript response. Now, Vaadin Flow has kind of a limitation. It has server state. Because you have your full UI in the browser, in the server. So you do a Java UI, and this will be synchronized with the client. So you have state. State is often a problem. Usually it's not a problem, but a lot of people think it's a problem. Like if you have Kubernetes or any other cloud technology and you want like dynamic scaling, then that's not good for applications that have state, because if like an instance is destroyed, you lose the state. And that's a problem, but also for that there are solutions how to overcome this situation. But that was not the only reason to create a new framework. It's called Hilla. By the way, Vaadin is the name for the female reindeer, because the framework comes from Finland, and Hilla is cloudberry. It's also a berry that only grows in the northern part of Europe. So they were thinking about how to do single-page application development, but more for Java developers. So that means we have Hilla, and you see there two logos. The one is React, that you may know, and the other one is Lit. Lit is a web component framework. It's before we had Polymer, also from Google, and Polymer is no longer maintained, so the new one that they created is Lit, or sometimes also known as Lit Element. And that means you really develop a single-page application like you do with Angular, React, or Vue, but you have some convenience. So if we go back to that slide, one thing that often is a problem is how do we access the API? And how do we secure the API? Or how do we deal with role-based security that should be the same on the client and on the server? And that's exactly what Hilla is doing. So we don't speak about REST controls, we speak about endpoints. And an endpoint will be used from the Hilla framework during runtime, and it will generate the client access code. We will see that in a minute how this works. So you don't have to care about communication. So you don't have a REST API, by the way. You have more like a remote procedure call API, right? But it doesn't matter because you don't need this API. And this is usually a question when I talk about Hilla, can we reuse this API? And I say, yes, you could, but you shouldn't, because it doesn't make sense. No. I see a lot of application or a lot of projects that are trying to create a REST API that serves everybody. So if you have a third party, then you can use this API. If you have a web UI, you can use this API. If you have a native mobile client, you can use that API. And that is usually not the best idea, because then you have a general purpose API and the client has to deal with structures that you get from this API, and that is not, or often not really what you need. So you have to transform it and restructure the data that you get, and that doesn't lead to efficient development. So maybe it's better to have like a backend for frontend that only serves one purpose, and that's the endpoint that you have there. So before we go to the code, let's check out some of the differences between these frameworks. So first of all, I was already talking about the programming model. With Thymeleaf, you really have this server-side rendering with HTML templates, and you can use, for example, htmx. By the way, there are other frameworks that do the same, more or less, to add some dynamic stuff. Vaadin from the programming model is pure Java server-side. You don't have to care about how this is rendered, because you use components from Vaadin that will be used on the client side. And Hilla uses the same components, by the way, but then you are on the client in the browser, and you develop usually with TypeScript and have a Java backend. So from the skills that are required to develop applications with these frameworks is Java Vaadin the most simple for a Java developer, because you just have to know Java. For sure, you have to know some CSS if you want to style the application, but this may be some developer that is doing a theme for your application based on the themes that comes with Vaadin, and then that's it. But if you do Thymeleaf, you have to deal with HTML and CSS. Maybe you need to know a bit more. And for Hilla, it's the same as you would do an Angular or React application, you have to know both, so Java and TypeScript, to develop applications. From the API point of view, with Thymeleaf, you wouldn't need any, but if you want to have some dynamic stuff in the web page with htmx, you will need a REST API anyway, or something like HTML endpoint. And for Hilla, you use these Java endpoints that are generated for the access in the client side, and that's it. Something that is often a bit underestimated are components. I'm currently in an Angular project, and they decided creating all their components that they need from scratch, and that's a bit of a pain, and it was underestimated the effort that you will need to have really good components that you can use in your application. And there, because Vaadin and Hilla are both web component based, you have web components from Vaadin, but you can also add other web components from other third-party providers, and you have a rich component model that you can use. So if you're developing business applications, there you usually have the same. You have input fields, you have buttons, you have grids, and so on. And there you have something that you can use right away, and it feels more like UI programming and less like HTML paging or pages designing. From the build, at the end, you just need Maven or Gradle. For all of these three frameworks, you don't need NPM. For sure, NPM is used, also Vite for the development time with Vaadin, for example. But you don't see it because you just have the Maven or Gradle build that does everything for you. That also means that you get a single deployment unit. So you don't have a separation with Vaadin and Hilla from client and backend. You have a single jar, and everything is included inside that. Service state I already mentioned. Thymeleaf maybe, depends on the scope of your Spring Beans in the backend. With Vaadin you have state, right? And with Hilla you have none, because Hilla is like every other single page application framework. You don't need service state because usually you have the state on the client side. And the last thing to mention is security. Thymeleaf, if you use Spring Boot or Spring Framework with it, then you have Spring Security, so everything is server-side secured with Spring Security. You can define who can access which URLs at the end. Vaadin comes with built-in role-based security. So per se, Vaadin is secure. It also uses CSRF to protect the endpoints, and the same is true for Hilla. So Vaadin and Hilla are secure by default, we can say. So now I talk a lot about these frameworks, and maybe we should go ahead and have a look how this looks like in the code. So I created a small application for you. Let's see if it works, right? I will tell you at the end where you can find the code, but it's not very interesting. You have like a master detail view here. You can edit data. And oh, really? Interesting. Now you can see it, but it will work anyway. Let's see if I can do. No, that wouldn't work. Sorry. Das habe ich eigentlich, aber das geht nicht. Erweitern geht schon, aber den sehe ich nachher nicht. Interessant. Also, let's try it like that. No. It worked before, but now it will not. Let me see. I will do that like this. Where is my browser? Weit vorher komme ich nicht an, dass ich etwas sehe. So, genau. Okay, that's my application that I like to show you. This one is Hilla now, but it looks like Vaadin, right? Because it uses the same web components. Huh? So it's more or less the same. The only difference is the programming model. And the other application that I have here is Thymeleaf. That's Bootstrap. That's why it looks like that. I couldn't use the Vaadin framework or the Vaadin components. Now, the interesting thing about the Thymeleaf version is that we have some goodies here. So I have like a say hello. This will be a bit hard now to see where I am. Because, yeah. They say hello, and you may not have noticed it, but there was no server request. So it was not a page reload, it was a dynamic way of rendering the page. So this happens because I'm using htmx together with Thymeleaf. And if we have a look at first, we have a look at the HTML page here. Then we see that, I go over here. Then we see that we have some, oops. No, it's better. That we have some new tags inside. So if you have a look at the form tag there, is it big enough? Can you see it from above? More or less. Okay. There's a hx post tag. That means this form will be posted by htmx and will not do a server call for Spring MVC. And then you see that the target is marked as the greeting. So the greeting ID, that's something that's below. We have an Thymeleaf fragment there with the greeting ID, and so it will just replace the div that you see below. And the other thing that we have here in this example is we have infinite scrolling. So if we go to this page here, and if I scroll down, maybe if I do it a bit faster, now it's not really visible, but the paging happens behind the scenes also with htmx. So it will do just a call on the backend. And if we have a look at the code of the backend, we see here the controller. Let's have the person controller. And here we have some special requests like this get mapping with the persons. And here we see a pageable, so it uses Spring Data. But there is also a notation hx request. And this doesn't come from htmx, by the way. That comes from an extension that Wim de Blauwe created for Thymeleaf. So it's a Spring Boot starter that you can use and integrates htmx with Thymeleaf. So you just have to mark that because htmx sends a special request. And with this hx request, everything will happen behind the scenes. So the extension from Wim will create or will use header information of the request and then make sure that this is called. And here we see that it just renders a fragment. That's the return that you see there. So we person, then we have this tr, so it's a row in a table, and the content rows, this will be re-rendered. So we have an infinite scrolling. So you see with the use of htmx together with Thymeleaf, you can create a web page that behaves like a modern application. That's the thing that I want to show you with that. Maybe I can go a bit further. That's better. Now the next application that we have here in this project is Vaadin. A lot of you already know Vaadin, but for those who have never seen a Vaadin application, we can see that here. That's a hello view. Let me see if I can make that a bit bigger. Wrong side, like that. Or I can do this one. That's better. Like this. Nice. So you see that's a view, and all you can see is it looks like a Swing application, right? Or any other traditional UI framework application. You have like a text field, you have a button. Button has a click listener with here a lambda that shows a notification. Then we have a layout, and at the end we add something to some top layout, and then it will render the application. And in my opinion, Vaadin is very underrated because it's so easy to create business applications with Vaadin. You will not find any other application that you will be on any other framework that will be so fast in building such types of applications. That's the main point. So this is Vaadin. Vaadin has some cool components. So I mean, before I had to create my paging by my own, but if you look at the master detail view here, we have like the same thing with infinite scrolling, but this comes from the component, so I don't have to do a lot to achieve that. In terms of Vaadin, I just have to use a grid, and then grid has a concept of data providers. And we will see that here. So I created a grid with columns. That's quite easy. And we have a set items method. And there we get a query. And the query has like page and offset. So everything that I need to page around is already contained. And I just need to go ahead and use that. So creating like a paging, filtering, and sorting grid is very easy with that technology. And so if you have business applications like I have, so the type of application I usually create for my customers look all the same. So you have a lot of data, database with tables, with forms where you enter data and stuff. And that's the perfect match for Vaadin. Now, if you like the idea how it works, and you like the components, but you want to have more client interaction, or you want to build an application that uses the browser APIs, like locations or any other stuff that you can do today with the browser, then you're not on the right side with Vaadin. You can do that. So I even can execute JavaScript from the server side. I can tell Vaadin, hey, execute that JavaScript on the browser, and it will do that. But that's maybe not the best idea. And that's another reason why they created Hilla. And here I created the same application with Hilla. And the difference here is when we look at the server side, we will find endpoints. So for example, we have a Hello World endpoint, and that's, you can think about the API with an endpoint. But as I said, it's not REST, it's RPC style. So I have a say hello method, and the say hello method will be executed from the client. For sure, it's an HTTP call with like a REST or with an URL where you will find say hello, and the query parameters, the name. But you can, or I wouldn't use that as an API anyway. But what's more interesting here is like the anonymous allowed annotation, because by default, Hilla endpoints are secure. You can't access them if you're not authorized. But if you want to have a public API like I do here, then you have to use this anonymous allowed annotation to allow that. And something else that maybe looks special is the non-null annotation. That's a Hilla annotation, and this is used for TypeScript. So behind the scenes, what happened here, the endpoint will be turned into like a REST controller that you know from Spring MVC. It will be annotated in some ways with Swagger annotation, and it will generate the Swagger API client. That's not entirely true. That's just that you can imagine what could happen. And then on the client side, I will have generated code. So this will be, first of all, in the front end, the generated folder. And here I find my Hello World endpoint. And the Hello World endpoint has a method, say hello. So I can use the same method with the same signature on the client side. And this will be behind the scene call the client on the server side. Right. We also have like a person endpoint for, this is a bit bigger. So we have all the methods, like I didn't show you the endpoint, but it's a CRUD endpoint with list, delete, add, or save, and stuff like that. And so you're free of generating that by yourself. So in my current project, we use Angular and we use REST APIs, we have Swagger, and we generate that more or less in the same manner, but all by hand. And we had to build that from scratch, so that was not really included. And that's a very time-saving, in my opinion, but it goes a bit further. If we look at the person class that is generated from, by the way, we have a person on the server side. It's an entity. Doesn't matter if it's an entity or a DTO. It's just for demo purposes. But we see here also that we have TypeScript code. That means all the attributes with the question mark are optional, for example. And so we have exactly the same model on the client as we have on the server. So every developer will know, oh, that's our person. It has these attributes. But that's not all. If we have a look at the person on the server side, here we are. Then we see, oops, it's an entity. By the way, I won't do that. I don't do entities to transfer objects to the client. It's just a demo. Usually this would be like a DTO. But here below we have an attribute. It's called email. And we have a bean validation annotation, email. So if we would do a check on the server side with bean validation, it will check if this field contains a valid email address. And the interesting thing about Hilla is that it does the same. So based on the annotations, or based on the classes, it will also generate a model class. So this model class here now is a description or is like metadata for the business object that I have, so for the person. And here we see that we have like different types. So we have a string, number model, and we also have here, it's missing, by the way, I see. Is it missing? That's strange. I regenerated it before. So you just have to believe me. It also would use the bean validation annotations to do validation on the client side. So you will have, it will not use bean validation because we are in TypeScript world and not in Java world, but it will mimic the bean validation also on the client side. So if we have a form, then it will also check if it's a valid email address. So, and for the rest, maybe just to have a quick look. The rest of the application looks like a standard single-page application. So we will have like views. So if we look at the Hello World view, this is not React now, that's lit. I prefer lit because it feels more like Java. So with the decorators here that we have to mark something as an element or so, that looks like Java. In my opinion, I'm not a really good TypeScript developer, but it looks more familiar. Jonas would say he would use React for sure together, but it doesn't matter. The point is lit is more mature because it was built with lit in the beginning, because Vaadin also uses lit for web components, and React was just added in the last few versions because for marketing purposes probably, or to make it the framework more popular, because there are way more React developers than lit developers. Okay, now let's go back to the end of my talk. So when I would use which framework? I think you already noticed that I'm a big Vaadin fan, because I really like it. And if you're a Java developer and have to build business applications, like real, so like an ERP system or like a backend system to manage some data, then I would go for Vaadin for sure, because it's the way easiest framework to achieve that. And for a Java developer, it's great because you don't have to know all the rest that comes with it. If your application has more client interaction, so if you have like the idea of, oh, my application could be offline capable, then you can't use Vaadin, because Vaadin without server connection is not really working. There are some ways to do that, but it's not recommended, or it's very hard to achieve. So I would go with Hilla. Or if you want to use all the browser APIs, it's much better, in my opinion. And the last point is, it may be that your front-end developers already know something about TypeScript, React, lit, whatever, and then it's a better fit. But the point is, with Hilla, you also have the same component model as with Vaadin. And so your applications would look the same as we have seen before. I just show you the Hilla application. I have the same with Vaadin, but the applications look both the same because they use the same layout, the same web components. It's more or less the same. And finally, Thymeleaf. If you want to build a web page, not an application, but more like something like a web page, then Thymeleaf is perfect because it's very easy. You just do HTML, you add some model stuff, and then you have the dynamic pages. And if you want to have more dynamic stuff, then you could use something like htmx. And with the addition from Vim, it's very well integrated. You don't have to do a lot to add that. And it has some advantages for sure. So search engine optimization may be easier because you deliver HTML page. So the Google or whatever search engine maybe find it easier to index your pages. And you have no JavaScript. But I think today no one disables JavaScript in the browser because nothing works if you do that. And you can cache your application pages. So if you have a lot of requests and you just deliver dynamic content, but it doesn't change a lot, then you can cache all what goes over the wire. Yes, that's finally it. Thank you. I'm sorry for the inconvenience just before it worked with the sharing, but as the cable was long enough, I think it was fine anyway. So the code you find on my GitHub account, CMAS CH, full stack is dead. And it's a stupid name. I should name it full stack is alive. That would be better. And you can get in touch. I have a web page, martinelli.ch. I write some articles. I do some videos sometimes. And I have talks. Thank you very much.